I am very excited for this final chapter because it's kind of the whole point of the course. Currently, we have a library of assets, which I had fun building. I hope you did too. But those assets by themselves do not fulfill the purpose of the project. Assembling those assets into a city is ultimately what we're trying to do. So please understand there are two distinct things here: the assets versus the assembly. I'm going to try and explain this as clearly as possible because it's fundamental to any production pipeline. If you want to make a short film, either by yourself or with a couple friends, you need to understand the relationship of assets to assembly. If you want to make a game, likewise, you need to understand assets and assembly. Literally, every professional production I've been a part of utilizes this concept. To help me explain this, I'm going to use a Lego analogy. An asset library is like having a box of Legos. Each piece is essentially an asset in the library. They can be a random assortment or a specifically organized collection. Either way, the whole point of having such a collection is to use those pieces to assemble something else, something bigger, something more complex. Now, let's say you finish your assembly and you decide, I wish all the yellow bricks were red instead. If this were a digital CG project, we could simply modify the source assets, make them red, and then when we reload the assembly, all the yellow bricks will be red. That's pretty cool and very powerful. What makes this possible with Blender is library linking. In other 3D apps, it may be called referencing. It's all the same concept of assemblies maintaining direct connections back to the source assets from which they're composed. This is important for efficient file storage, project organization, minimal redundancy, and especially the ability to modify assets globally. This asset library linking and assembly workflow has been around forever. All you need is to organize your blend files intentionally and understand how to use the linking function. So Blender's new asset browser doesn't make this possible, it simply aims to make it more intuitive. Now we're going to use this new feature for our Cubicity project, but please always keep in mind the concepts we discussed here: assets, assemblies, and linking. Okay? All right, let's go. Let's finally incorporate our assets into the asset browser. This scene has been updated since the last time we saw it, because I have done a global pass at making sure all assets that should be randomized have that feature incorporated. Also, all the assets that need emission, that's been incorporated, as well as some additional assets from the rehearsal of the course. So let's quickly go through all our assets before we assetize them. So we'll start with standalone. This is roof access CG cookie. I suppose the only notable thing is that this is still a collection and it's being randomized. So if I duplicate both objects, you can see randomization doesn't require them to be combined into one object because they're separate objects, and I don't care, how the randomization happens between separate objects in this case. Make sure to delete that. But as you'll see, some objects are still in a collection, like roof access, also the water tower. This is also implementing randomization. We've got our traffic lights in a collection as well, featuring emission only on the light that we want traffic to be functioning according to. And then another traffic light, I do remember making two of these. I'm not sure I'm going to use this one, but anyway, it's there. All right, then we've got our standalone edits. Any objects that I combined but might want to edit, they are in there. We've got our bench. Let's see, whoops. All right, this one I think is not randomized at all. I mean, city benches are usually kind of all the same, so I didn't feel like that was necessary. One of the few that's not being randomized. We've got a new asset. All right, so this is a bush along with a bush L, like shaped as a 90-degree L, so it can wrap around a building. And you can see that they are duplicating with a slightly varied green leaf color. They are also single objects. I'm going to hit Alt-G to make sure I keep all their transforms at 0. I'll go over why that's important in a minute. We have the two HVAC units that you saw. I need to Alt-G to clear their transforms, but then an additional HVAC unit, Alt-G, that came from rehearsal. Built on the same principles, just slightly different. What else do we have? The lamppost. Nice and glowing, that warm color. We've got the hotel sign, the parking sign, and the theater sign. The theater is the only one that's not being randomized. I'm probably not going to use it more than once in a single shot, and I really liked that red and yellow light combination. Let's see, next we have the skylight. So this one's kind of interesting because as we duplicate this, you'll see they randomly will be on or off. So I kind of hacked the system we created by lying to Blender and saying that it is a geometry nodes object through that color attribute. And with this specific object, the glass emit material works fine, believing that it's a geometry node object and implementing the Musgrave texture and extremely small UV islands so that some skylights are lit up at night and some are not. So I thought that was a pretty neat hack of our system. Next, we've got tree medium. This is a new object. We built the tree small, and now we've just got two options so that the sizes aren't, identical through all the duplicates. Alt G to make sure we clear the transforms. Then we've got our bus vehicle. That's way off. We've got our vehicle, which has randomization implemented. So we shouldn't have to worry about cars being the same color, as well as the pickup truck. Alt G, Alt D. I just love doing the randomization. I think that's a really fun feature of our assets. Let's move on to the ground collection. The only new thing here is I added this big rectangle called the backlot, which is important because if you remember our template, let's look at that. This brown section in between our city blocks, our buildings are going to line the border, but this leaves some open space behind the buildings that without our backlot object, it would just be, a hole in space. And so this is a copy of our asphalt material. If we switch to the nighttime HDRI, I really like the way these materials came out, but it's got this patchy effect. With asphalt lots, often you have isolated repairs for cracks and things like that. And after, years of use, it ends up having this interesting patchwork type effect. And so that's the only new asset. Very simple, it's just a plane. In the ground collection, now for our buildings, we do have a few new buildings. Let's see, the first one you have seen before. The next one, I think you've seen this one too, but it does have randomization implemented, just slightly in the canvas color. I think the window is a little bit as well. Let's see, next, I don't think you've seen this building, but it's got randomization. There's another building. This one might be my favorite building I've created so far. It's just got a lot of interesting details and variety. I just think it's a classy one. And it also has some subtle color shifting. Next, our parametric, nothing has changed about this one. We've got residential B. This is actually the first building I created for the project as a whole. And if we switch our lighting to be daytime, the colors do randomize, but they might be a little flamboyant, very saturated pastel-y type colors, but I'm going to wait and see how it works out in the final assembly. I do like that it's more fun and kind of that cute adjective, but if we want to change that later, it will be very easy to do so. And then this is also a new building. Randomization should be working. Okay, yeah, it is, but that first one was almost an exact copy. But I think this is a fun building, not symmetrical. And, you can imagine some little tables being down here. Let's say the first floor is a restaurant of some sort. Anyway, on to the skyscrapers. This is the one we built. It does have randomization implemented. We've got another skyscraper that's similar, but a little bit different. Randomization as well. And then this one is one of my favorite buildings, Alt D. It's got some fairly strong color choices like pinkish windows, but again, I'm going to wait to see how it looks in the assembly. I don't want to revert to my natural realistic instinct and make things more drab. I want to keep this kind of upbeat and airy or cute version of a city. And I believe that is all of our assets. Okay, so now that we've gone through the list, let's incorporate them into the asset browser. Let's switch our editor here to the asset browser. And by default, it's going to look in your current file, anything that you have marked as an asset. We don't have any, but also we don't want to limit our library to just the current file. Instead, we can point to a directory on our hard drive as the source of our asset library, so multiple .blends can have assets into the library. So to create that, go to Edit Preferences, and in the File Paths tab at the very bottom, you have Asset Libraries. By default, you should just have this user library, wherever your system decides to put it. But if we hit the plus button, we can choose a new directory. So let's go up one level. And I'm going to choose Cubicity Assets, which has our Cubicity Assets.blend. It's kind of weird that it doesn't show that blend file is in this directory. But if we add the asset library, it will assume the folder name. I'm going to rename it Cubicity Asset Library. And then we can close user preferences. Now in our asset browser, instead of current file, we can choose Cubicity Asset Library. And so from here, I'm going to quickly add some assets in a quick and dirty sort of way. Specifically, I'm going to choose the roof access because it is unique in that it's two objects within a collection. So you can right click on a collection and choose Mark as Asset. Over here, it'll pop up and you get the collection and a nice thumbnail. But if we hit the N key, you also get options for adding an author or a description or some tags. So you have a lot of organizational opportunity, and I highly recommend that doing this correctly means keeping it organized, adding tags. You can also add catalogs over here. But for this first example, I'm going to only add assets so we can go over some kind of quirky parts before we spend time really committing to what these assets will be called and how they're going to be organized. All right, so we've got roof access, which is a collection. I'm also going to add, how about a tree? All right, let's add that, which is an object, not in a collection, mark as asset. All right, you can see that here, good thumbnail, icon that it's an object. And then in the building, we're going to add the parametric building. Also, it is an object technically, but we also know that it's a geometry nodes object. And it has a lot of dependencies, and that's going to be important to see. So let's right click and mark as asset. Okay, from here, I'm going to hit Control S to save our scene file, which saves our asset status. So we can create a new scene file. I'm going to delete everything. And this represents an assembly file. It doesn't have any geometry itself. It's just going to be the place we drag all of our assets. And let's split our window and change the editor to the asset browser. Let's choose our asset library. And first we'll grab this tree and we get this lovely little interface where we have a grid floor. It shows us that we're dragging our asset to the grid floor. It's also nice because if we had like a cube and we drug this onto the cube, it snaps to the top. It's a really, useful interface element. Also in our outliner, you'll see that these are just simply the geometry objects because by default, the asset browser uses appending to bring this data in. So we can tab into edit mode and modify this. So that might seem pretty cool. By default, also, they are sharing object data, so you can see that these will reflect the same changes. However, as an appendage, it has no connection back to the source file. And so this breaks the whole pipeline mentality of being able to change the source file so it updates here. And so, for example, if we wanted to add a branch to the tree, I think we can right click in the asset browser and open the blend file. Yeah, and it opens a separate Blender instance, which is actually very nice. It opens up the source file. And if we edit, it's taking a while to compile the shaders, I think. If we edit our tree, so it has a branch, you know, it's a small change. It's mostly as an example, but it's not unthinkable that this could be, you know, something that I want. Wow, it's really slow for some reason. All right, so we've modified this object. Control S, we save it. And now if we go back to our other scene, and let's even save it. Shift Control S. I'm going to save it in the directory above as assembly, Cubicity City Assembly Test. And then if we revert, just to make sure that we're updating everything, what we've already appended to the scene does not update. But if I bring in a new one, it should have the branch, okay? So again, the whole idea of a library is to be able to make that change in the source and these update with it. So I find it very confusing that append is the default setting for the asset browser, because a library built on appending is extremely limited, but a library built on linking is very powerful. So personally, I think linking should be the default. Another problem with appending. Let's bring in our residential parametric building. You'll see our outliner gets a ton of objects. It's essentially bringing in everything that has to do with this geometry nodes object, including the source collection, all the parts, as well as the global UV object that's used in the shader. And if I bring it in again, click and drag, it doesn't duplicate all the dependent collections. It's able to use what's already been appended in because it's set to reuse data. Now, if we switch that to just regular append, we're going to duplicate this over and over, and our outliner becomes an absolute mess. And so when it comes to an assembly, I really want the outliner to be as minimal and clean as possible. And so I highly recommend you conceptualize your library to use the linking function. So let's switch that to link, and let's just get rid of everything. Let's just delete the default collection hierarchy. And now as the link function, let's bring in our parametric building. All right, already much cleaner. We only bring in the object itself, plus the access to the modifiers. So if we, switch to our modifier panel, we have our geometry nodes parameters, but they're grayed out. Also, we cannot move the object, and this is true for the tree as well, which is a linked in object. It goes right to the origin of the world, and you cannot move it. So when you link in an object, in order to move it, or in the case of the geometry nodes object, to be able to change the height and width, you need to establish a library override. And I recommend you do this by right-clicking on our object in the outliner, going to ID data, and make library override single. All right, this will keep our object clean in the outliner, but it unlocks the modifier parameters so we can adjust this. And you'll see the teal color pop up if you change these parameters. Also in the transform data, if you move it around, which we can do now. If you see that teal color, it means it's the result of a library override. And so this is much more useful, keeping the outliner clean and minimal. I can duplicate this object around. We get that functionality of color randomization. I can change the height, the width. And so this is how I want to bring in a geometry nodes building. And any other object that's linked in this way, meaning an object asset type, I need to right click in the outliner and ID data, make library override single, and then I can move it. And we get the teal color in the parameters. You may have also noticed that the interface changed. When I link in an object, we no longer get that cool yellow bounding box with the white grid. It just places it at the center of the world. No more convenient snapping. And for every asset that I bring in, I need to right click, ID data, make library override in order to move it. But I think I should be able to duplicate what I've already brought in, and it works fine with a library override inherited. But it's pretty annoying to always have to create that library override, which you do not have to do for collection assets. So if we bring in the roof access, let's try and drop it on the top of that building. Did it work? No, it looked like it worked. But right out of the box, we're able to move it. We don't have to create a library override. We can snap it if we use face snapping. snap it to the top of the building, and it's very clean in the outliner, arguably the cleanest option. We can duplicate it to get the random effects on the material. And really the only negative, in my opinion, is you have this empty representation, which is placed at the center of the world in our source file. So this is actually kind of important to understand. So if I save this as a temporary assembly test, let's go back to our assets, and I'm going to assetize the water tower, but I'm going to move the objects off to one side like this. All right, with those moved, right click on the water tower, mark as asset, Control S to save. Let's go back to our assembly test file, and let's bring in the water tower as a link. And you'll see that our water tower is offset. We have an empty at the center of the world. And so that's annoying. And that's why you want to make sure that your assets are in the center of the world for, most intuitive linking setup. Okay. At this point, I hope you're not confused, but I certainly was when I started using the asset browser, because there's a lot of caveats to whether you append in an object type asset, append in a collection type asset, or link in object versus asset. And so personally, I recommend linking in collections and all of your assets be collection assets, with the exception of the parametric building. Again, this keeps our library built on the concept of linking. So if I want to change the water tower, every instance of that linked water tower in the assembly will update. Also, this linking centric workflow aligns with, again, virtually every production pipeline I've been a part of, where appending is just a rare option that we'll use, but overall it's built on the concept of linking. So what this means for our library, if we jump back over to the asset, Cubicity assets source file, I don't need to save this temporary test, is that for the cleanest asset browser experience, I'm going to create a collection for every object. Where did that collection go? So this is bench underscore CG cookie. I know this is a little bit silly. We'll throw in our single object bench into that collection. Make sure it's visible. And then I will assetize the collection, not the object. Right click, mark as asset. And when it comes to our, let's see, the tree model, let's clear the asset, right click and clear it. We'll add a collection. Nuts, I'm adding the collection way outside. I forget what this is called. We can just copy the name, paste it to the collection, and assetize the collection, mark as asset. All right, so this does lengthen the process of assetizing everything, but that's what I'm going to do. Again, I think it's just the cleanest method. And so I don't think I need to bore you by individually assetizing each one. Now that we've got a few, I do want to go over some features of the asset browser, like organizationally. I do want all of our assets to credit the author. So I can add CG cookie in parentheses, my name. I guess I don't need a last name. There's only one Kent at our company. Select that. I can paste it to each one. And beyond that, we can add a description. I mean, these are pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to take the time to add a description. Please do, if you want to with your assets, but I think it's, not strictly necessary. Tags are optional as well. So I think that for the water tower, also for the HVAC units and the roof access, these are all related to one another by being relevant to the tops of buildings or the roofs of buildings. And so I'm going to add a tag for roof. And when you add a tag, it becomes searchable. So ROOF, it searches the name of the asset itself, which has roof in it, but also the tags, which water tower does not have roof in the name. It's only in the tag. And so some other tags I might add would be like ground assets for, lamppost or tree or bench. We're not necessarily going to put a bench on the roof. I guess we could. It's our city. We can do what we want, right? But I know that I'm tempted to add a lot of tags, but keep in mind that the name of the asset is also searchable. So like our residential parametric building. Oh wait, that doesn't have buildings in the name. I thought it did, and so I wouldn't need to add the tag building. But I don't know, maybe you could add the tag building, or you can also add it to a catalog, which I think is what I'll do. So buildings or standalone ground, like we were creating a tag to be ground. We can also add that to a catalog. Let's see, new catalog, standalone roof. And we can also add like streets. So this is, similar to the collections that we established in the outliner, but maybe a little more refined now that we're further along in the process of this project. So streets, was there anything else? No, that's probably it. And so if we go to all, we can drag in building to the buildings catalog, standalone ground, or no, standalone roof for the roof access for the water tower. The bench goes in standalone ground, and these become, basically folders within the asset library as a whole. So yeah, I will create all of our assets off camera, and then we'll go over the final result of that before we begin building the assembly. But hopefully you have a much better idea now of the function of the asset browser, especially linking versus appending. That's really important that you understand that. So I will see you again after I've assetized everything. Since the last video, I have finished assetizing all of our assets. Check it out. It's a pretty decent start, I think, though hopefully with your contributions, it will grow to be much larger. But we've also got some elements of organization through catalogs. We've got all our buildings and materials, which I have not showed you how to assetize them, which I will. We've got our standalone ground assets. We've got our standalone roof assets, and we've got our street elements. In addition to that, if we go back to the all category and hit the N key, we've got our author established for every single one of these assets. Remember, I want authors to get credit, so that's an important bit of data to fill. And we've also got a couple tags like foliage for our bushes and our trees. Well, not this tree, I guess. And in addition to that, I think I just have the parametric tag. So I didn't go crazy on the tags. You certainly can obsess over that, but until the library gets bigger, I don't think it's that important. We could maybe categorize this one as a residential tag, even though that's established in the name. But yeah, I guess that's where I don't know which is better, because if you stick to the naming convention, then residential is taken care of if we search for it, residential. But skyscraper is mainly a business. So you could categorize buildings by business or residential. And so that would make sense to tag them that way. But also we've got the building catalog, and it's not going to be that difficult to just scroll through this list and pick one that we like. So I'm not going to obsess over it now, except for the author information. But as the library grows, it'll make sense to maybe add more tags. Now back to the materials. How do we assetize them, and why are they all black? Well, Control space to go back to our previous user interface layout. And if we go to our materials, the way you assetize these is simply right click on the material slot and mark as asset. Now in this case, I created all the materials, and if I want to add them to the library, comprehensively, it might be easier just to add a new temporary object and then count your material slots. Add all those materials to this object, and then one by one mark them as assets. I realized after the fact that there's a much quicker way to assetize all your materials at once, and that's with the outliner in Blender file mode. Simply reveal all your materials, shift click to select them all, right click, and mark as asset. Much easier. But as far as them being all black, and furthermore, all of our library is black and white monochromatic, which is frankly a pretty big disappointment to me. I'm a visual person, so I was really looking forward to something like the demo file for the diorama. I mean, look how beautiful these assets look. The materials too. So that's what kind of got me excited when I first saw the asset browser. So why are ours black and white? Well, when it comes to the materials, it's sourcing the preview. If we go to our material panel, from this preview section where you can choose, a cube, or I guess that's a plane, You can choose a shader totem is what I call those. And this is model data stored somewhere in the bowels of Blender's program files. And those objects do not have vertex color information. Whereas all of our materials get their color information from vertex colors. And so since that's not there, they all appear as a default color of black, which is the color equivalent of 0, with the exception of this backlot material, which has its color established by the material, not the vertex colors. And so I am disappointed by that, but I'm not disappointed by the way we planned out our materials. We're using the fewest amount of materials as possible and sharing them across all of our assets. That's a very efficient, intelligent way to work. But the way the asset browser sources its thumbnails, I don't know if it's too strong to say we're kind of punished for that, but we don't get the benefit of beautiful materials, at least in terms of how they look in the thumbnail. So I might be tempted to just disable them showing up. Okay, well, maybe that filter is not working. But what about our objects? Why are they all gray? Well, that brings me to a few assets that I did not assetize because I want to go over a couple protocol things to keep in mind as you do that. So let's take the theater sign, for example. For one, we are using the link collection approach for dragging our assets from the browser into our assembly scene. And so instead of leaving the object by itself, I want to create a new collection. Meant that to be in the standalone. And I'm just simply going to copy the name, Control-C, paste it here. Need to turn on screencast keys. And then move the collection. Now, interestingly, I don't think the collections are sorted alphabetically. That is the default. And if we uncheck that and recheck it, I guess it doesn't sort those. So I like to keep them organized that way. So I'm going to move it. Let's see. I think it's the last of the signs. There we go. And oh wow, I need to put the object in that collection. Now remember that when we link in a collection, it uses the world origin as the origin for that collection. And so it's important that we place the object at a location that makes sense with the world origin. So the world origin, if we hit Shift-C in the viewport, is where the cursor is placed by default. If we hit the end panel and look at view, the location of the 3D cursor 0, 0, 0, that is what our linked collection is going to use as the origin. So for the sign, it doesn't really make sense for the origin to be at the bottom. When we link it into the scene, the sign will be just slightly above the ground plane. And it's more intuitive when you think about the sign being attached to a building. And so with that in mind, it would make more sense to select this face, Shift-S, cursor to selected, tab back to object mode, object menu, set origin to the 3D cursor, and then hit Alt-G to move that to the world origin. And now, when we assetize this, mark as asset, your object is exactly where you would want it to be linked in. And so now that that is the case, we can go find the sign theater. Let's copy our author name, paste it there. And that asset is done being incorporated. But I've also got another one here, the pickup truck, because if you remember, we modeled all our vehicles on the street and kind of placed them away from the object origin. The world origin. The object origin is correct. It's at the bottom of the wheels in the center of the vehicle. So I can hit Alt-G to move it back to the center of the world. It might help if I have our grid floor and the axes visible, minus the Z. And so if we assetize this, make sure we have standalone collection selected, add a new collection, and then copy the vehicle name, or the object name, and paste it there, throw that object into the collection, and now right click, mark as asset. Let's go find that one. You'll see that the thumbnail is not really ideal compared to the other vehicles for that matter. And that's because the auto thumbnailer is great, but it does depend on your asset facing the direction you want according to what Blender thinks is the front of the scene. And so if we show our widgets, the front of the scene is the negative y-axis right here. That's kind of pointing forward. And so as you can see, the angle of our thumbnail is like this. So to make a more intuitive thumbnail, I'm going to rotate this -90 degrees. And then if we select that asset, hit the in panel, and then click this generate preview icon, it'll reload, and now our thumbnail is much more intuitive. So as you're assetizing, keep those things in mind. Object needs to be at the center of the world, especially if you're using linked collections like we're doing. And also the object needs to be facing an intuitive direction so it looks good in the thumbnail. Now, if I remember correctly, I think there's one more asset in the buildings collection that I have not assetized. Okay, that's right. It's this one. Because with the corner buildings, you might be wondering what's the best place to put the object origin. And as you can see, I'm putting it kind of at the corner of the building, which is cut off due to this bevel. So how do we get the origin there? Well, the way I like to do it is you tab into edit mode, select a vertex that is on the wall side, and then we can Shift D to duplicate that, drag it out in the Y axis, hold Control and snap to the corresponding vertex. And where you snap that should be a pretty good spot for your object origin. So Shift S, cursor to selected, delete that vertex, leave object edit mode. I just called it object edit mode to get to object mode, and then your object menu, set origin to the 3D cursor, Alt G to move it back to its proper place. And now we should be ready to assetize this. Copy the name, Control C, add a new collection, paste it, drag the object to the collection, right click, mark as asset. If we go find that, make sure that the thumbnail looks good. So this is kind of a preference thing. Is this an appealing angle? It might make more sense to rotate it 90 degrees and then refresh the thumbnail. I do think that is a little more characteristic of the asset. But, there is kind of a funny side effect. Since we're using certain coordinates in the material, now our bevel has the texture stretched completely, on that one corner. Maybe it's fine. I don't know if anyone would notice that. But you could simply undo the rotation. Whoops, I thought it would just undo the rotation, but it also undid the thumbnail. So let's redo that. Does it redo the thumbnail? Okay, cool. And then we'll just rotate it -90. Okay, so now we've got a good thumbnail, but our object is properly oriented. Though now that I'm thinking about it, it doesn't matter how what orientation we save it in this file, because when we link in the collection, if we rotate the building this way, it's going to have the same problem. So, I'll just leave it here because I know this orientation is the intentional one. Okay, let's get into the thumbnails and why they're showing up so ugly and gray. So if we hop over to the Blender documentation, at the asset browser page, all the way down at the bottom, we get information about asset previews. And we have this little link for controlling the look of preview images, which tells us that, here it is, the preview images are rendered using the Workbench engine. All right, so if we switch to the Workbench engine, which is a render setting, so Workbench, you'll see where we're getting this information from. So unfortunately, it won't take our Eevee preview, which is a pretty big bummer, if I'm honest. And I feel like this is certainly going to be added as a feature in the future because it would be so intuitive. It's already set up, the thumbnailer is set up in a really good way, but it's just pretty lame that it only uses Workbench. But you might be thinking, well, can we switch our viewport shading to use the attribute so we see our color information? Remember, all our assets are getting color from the vertex colors information. And so if we click on our object in the asset browser and regenerate the thumbnail, we don't get anything. Well, in my rehearsal, it at least worked, but it simply went with the gray still. So do I have to be in Eevee? Interesting. So when the render engine is Eevee, it will generate the preview, but not from the Workbench engine. However, I do think from the Workbench engine, you can enable stuff like Cavity. I wonder if that matters if we're in Eevee. I'm kind of real-time troubleshooting this. So Cavity, If we redo the preview, okay, yeah, I don't see that show up in the preview. Anyway, I don't mean to be a complainer, but I am pretty disappointed that the thumbnailer doesn't just take the Eevee viewport, because that's exactly how I want it to look. However, we do have one more option if we really want it to look pretty, and that is if we go back to the asset browser documentation page, it's also possible to load images from our hard drive to replace the auto-generated previews. So I'll show you that next. Since I want the Eevee preview, I'm simply going to turn off our overlays. And for this building, pick an angle that you like. And essentially I'm going to take a screenshot of this asset and save that to an intentional directory. So since I'm on Windows, I can hit Shift Window key S, and I can draw a box around my asset. And then I can click on that app and save it. So navigate to my assets. All right, remember that's the Cubicity_assets folder. And I'm going to create a new folder and call it thumbnails and put them all here. And I really should have copied and pasted the asset name. Let me jump over to Blender and grab that. Control C to copy. Let's go back here and we'll paste it. Oh, it has that number at the end. Yeah, I want to sort that so it's clean. But anyway, we'll save this. And first let's address the name. Why is it number 4? Oh, wait, I remember. When it comes to the randomization, the name will actually change the random color. So if we delete that, the randomization, I guess, depends on that in some way. And so I really didn't like the purple as the default, but I liked the 4th iteration. And so I'm going to keep the name that, but I can change the collection to eliminate the 4. And does this update in our asset browser? Yes, it does. Cool. All right, so the thumbnail that we just took, let's apply that here. Just simply click the folder icon to open, and then we navigate to the thumbnail folder, and we can click and load that. And doing that for every single asset is how we'll get the browser looking pretty. I will do that because I really want it looking pretty, but I will do that off camera. And I will close this video by saying there are add-ons that will auto-generate thumbnails like this, so feel free to take advantage of those. But I'm going to stick to the screenshot tool because I try to use as few add-ons as possible and teach from a stock Blender perspective. And so I better get to work making thumbnails. Hey, look at us now. After about an hour, we have a beautiful asset library, the way I dreamed it could be. Everything easily distinguishable, even the materials I gave a thumbnail as a bonus. And now when we look at our buildings catalog, they are distinguishable, maybe even make them large thumbnails to really drink it in. Materials, so all I did was add a sphere, apply the material, and give it some relevant vertex colors, with the exception of the brick, which would look terrible on a sphere. I put it on a cube instead. And so now these are distinguishable. Our ground standalone assets looking good. Our roof assets and our streets also looking good. After all the work we put into this, I, for one, can just scroll up and down this library for longer than maybe we should. But with it completed, make sure you save your file and all your thumbnails will be associated with the asset browser going forward. We're ready to create our assembly. Let's do it. We will create a new file. I'm going to select everything, hit X and delete. And we will begin with our streets. So I'm going to rename our collection streets. And then let's split our viewport, maybe the timeline. Let's just take that over instead of splitting it, and we'll switch that to be the asset browser. And instead of current file, we will use Cubicity Asset Library. And we want to make sure instead of append, we're using link. Let's jump to our streets catalog. Maybe use those large thumbnails instead. And let's click and drag our street to the middle. Alt-G. And this one shouldn't need any orientations modified. It should be good exactly how it is. Then let's grab our other street sections, Alt-G to start with, and then snap them using our increment snap. Perfect. Let's change it to absolute grid, GX. hold control and snap it. Oh, okay. I remember it was a 0.5 unit difference in the x-axis. So actually, we can do that manually. GY 0.5. A better way to implement 0.5 increment snapping is to go to our viewport overlay options and under scale, change it to 0.5. Now we can use increment snapping, GY, hold control, and it snaps at half increments. Okay, and then our 2-lane, Alt-G, GY, hold control, and snap. And then our backlot. Now this one is snapped to the corner just so that there's a little bit of intersection between the backdrop and the sidewalk. So we can still use increment, Alt-G, G, Shift-Z, hold control, and that should snap perfectly. So we get a little bit of intersection, right? Doesn't look like it's intersecting the sidewalk. Okay, now it is. And with all these elements in the scene now, we can simply duplicate them. Maybe switch to material preview so it's nice and pretty. And we've done this once before when we were designing how the streets would lay out. It's quite simple with the snapping, kind of like a digital Lego system. And then once we get a whole section, we can duplicate all of them. Although actually, before I duplicate the streets, we need the backlots duplicated. And just like we designed, I'll do 4 backlots and then streets bordering the gaps in between. And that's still just a half unit off, so GY 0.5. Now, one quick tip, I enabled the absolute grid. If we turn that off, if we want to duplicate these in the y-axis, we need that 0.5 offset, but we can duplicate them in y, hold control, and it will maintain the 0.5 offset added to the standard unit grid size. So only in the y-axis does it really make sense to have that setting turned off. And now that we've got our city street laid out, I don't know, I'm having second thoughts about the backlot. I don't know if it needs to be intersected. It looks kind of weird since we offset the rotation of our sidewalk panels. Let's just move that down so it's not intersecting that bad. Okay, now our sidewalks are straight again. And we can start adding buildings. So let's switch to our building catalog. And let's begin with our resident corner A. All right, click and drag to the scene, Alt-G. And with our random color, you'll see me get a little specific in that I don't really like the green building. I'm okay if it's in the background, but the way I'm thinking of laying this city out is the center is the most important, so it's going to be the most tailored for my renders. But as we get to the borders of these city blocks, it's more filler, and so I'm going to be less specific with those. And so, maybe this can exist on the outside, but if I want a more conventional color, I think that's pretty much blue, then we can duplicate. Oh, look, there's a problem there. I only set half of the window to emit. So that's something I will need to resolve. I'm going to wait a little bit to change that because I want to, make a little more progress duplicating buildings around. But in dealing with the random color, if I want something specific, you'll just see me duplicate a bunch of times and then pick one that I like. In this case, I'm fine with what we have here, but you'll see me do that a lot. All right, so Alt-G, G-Shift-Z, so it only moves in X and Y, and snapping right there to the city corner. Beautiful. All right, let's grab another corner building. How about this one? Residential corner D. Ooh, we have a problem there. Alt-G. Okay, so that's already 2 asset problems. I think now it's probably worth fixing. Let's save our scene. And this is going to be 1 directory up from our Cubicity assets, and we'll call this Cubicity Assembly version 01. That makes me think, if in a year from now we've had a lot of contributions from viewers like you, the city could be up to version, 50 and look totally different than it will at the end of the course. And that's a pretty cool thought. But anyway, more on that. This will be version 1. Save that. And now we can right click on an asset and open the blend file, the source blend file. So it'll launch a new instance of Blender. And I'll move that so that we can adjust. What was it? It wasn't a standalone asset. They were both buildings. All right, so here the window, only half was set to emit. So let's select that face, go to vertex paint mode, make sure we are using a white, 0.5 value, not quite white. And in the is emit, Shift K. There we go. So now when I save the file, since we're using linked collections, everywhere that's using this will be updated as well. But there was another change, and it was not this building. Was it this one? Yeah. Okay, you can see how it's offset, Alt-G, and then Control-S to save. All right, now we can close this instance of Blender, and I believe we need to refresh, which we can do in a couple ways. For one, we can simply revert the file and it's like opening new, it refreshes everything. Or if you don't want to do that, we can jump in our outliner to the Blender file mode. And at the very bottom, it will show our linked.blend files. So let's right click and you can choose reload and you'll see any changes happen without closing Blender. So now that we've got our corner building here in the center, I can go back to snapping it properly. That looks good. How about we throw in a parametric building? Now remember, this one is unique because it's not a collection, it is an object. If we go back to our view layer mode, let's, we've not been maintaining organization here at all. So let's create a new collection in the scene collection and call it buildings. And take all our buildings so far and put them in the building collection. Okay. And that parametric building needs to have a library override. So right click, ID data, make library override. Now we can move it, snap it into position. We can also adjust the height. Let's see, we'll make this one a little skinny. Let's say 2 units wide. We can keep the 4 height. I think that looks good. I'm going to use the parametric maybe more than the others because it does have a little more flexibility when it's duplicated. So Shift D to duplicate. And let's say in the main corner, it's going to be smaller, like 1 unit wide, maybe only 3 units tall. But then I can also duplicate it for the outskirts and make it bigger. So, not only taller, but significantly wider, so it takes up a lot of space. And it looks like our backlot still has some intersection issues. Maybe I need to trust that it was zeroed out properly. Let's just click them all, Alt-click in the Z location and hit 0. No, there's still some intersection. Okay, sorry, I'm remembering now. I think the intersection is intended to happen behind where the buildings intersect with the sidewalk. All of it's just trying to keep it without holes on the ground plane. Anyway, the point being, closer to the center of our city street, our parametric buildings will be smaller. And then as we get to the outskirts, which we won't be focusing on, they can take up more space by being larger. Also, let's turn off the balconies for one. And these are almost the same color. I wonder if we can get a different color here. All right, that's purple. I'd like a red. Oh, perfect. Okay, so we'll duplicate until I get the color I like. And then just swap its position. Let's see, let's add another building. How about this one? That one looks pretty cool. Alt-G, RZ90. Let's place that one at the corner. This one isn't explicitly a corner, but it can work as a corner. And I like that. And we'll move this one close by. Excellent. We're making progress. All right. How about we add this residential B building? Alt-G. Let's snap it beside that other one. That's a good amount of space, I think. Maybe throw this residential corner C beside it. Alt-G. We'll make the awning face forward. And then on this side, we'll make it like an alleyway. So give it extra space. And maybe it's time to step up to a skyscraper. Alt-G, G, and Shift-Z, and snap it to the sidewalk. Give it a little extra space for an alleyway. So I think I want the skyscraper all the way over here to the corner. Again, there's kind of like a residential focus on the center. And then as we approach the outskirts, we get taller and more businessy with skyscrapers. The reason being because I'm going to focus my attention in the renders on the center street corner here. And I need big buildings in the back to take up the most space. If we try and fill it with these little small buildings, we'll have tons of duplicates. It'll be obvious. But the bigger the building, the duplication won't be as noticeable. And typically in a city, you kind of have districts, more residential and then more business corporate. So those two themes were kind of working to our advantage. And then let's also take another skyscraper, throw it in the scene. Let's see, we'll snap it to Z of being a 0 value. There we go. So we have the tallest building in the very back. And we will need to duplicate this. Whoops, I thought I had that selected. Shift D. We will need to duplicate it several times on the outskirts. Looks like I need to move 0.5 in Y. 0.5. There we go. It's maybe a little too far. And so let's kind of focus on the skyscrapers a little bit. And we don't always have to use the same ones on the corners. This one actually might be big enough for only 2 buildings. Ooh, I don't love this one. The randomization gave the windows a red hue. I don't love that. Let's get back to the yellow. Huh, that's interesting. I must not have noticed that during the testing of the material. Not a huge fan of that. But now we're back to the blue windows and yellow emission. And these buildings kind of intersect a little bit. And that's okay. You know, the whole focus on units when we built these things was to keep them in the ballpark, right? I didn't expect them to be perfect. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with simply scaling this in the y-axis a little bit on each of them to make sure that they do not intersect. Nothing wrong with that. No one's going to notice. And that can give us our space in between. Because it would look really weird if they were, you know, crashing together. And let's see, are there any buildings I haven't used yet? That's kind of my goal, to get to the point where we've seen at least one of each building used. And I think we have. Yeah, so let's take another parametric and get into the, you know, duplication part where we're trying to do it intelligently. Now we're back to that teal color. I think I'm fine with that for this building. Let's make it a little, actually, let's make it smaller. This can be the smallest building, but wider. Let's turn balconies on. Might as well leave fire escapes on. I mean, we do have them side by side here, so maybe in that case we turn the fire escapes off. And, you know, everyone's just doomed in the case of a fire if you live in that building. And something also to keep in mind, I don't necessarily have to drag it from the asset browser. Once I have it in the scene, it's probably easier just to duplicate. I wonder, so when we dragged it in, we get this actually really nice color. It's kind of light, almost white blue on top. I wonder if we get that same color by duplicating. We do, interesting. So dragging it into the viewport from the asset browser is like duplicating what's already used in the scene. I assume when you use the link method. All right, so let's rotate this 90 degrees. You know, I am using this directly across the street. It is a different color, And also keep in mind, we will be seeing it from the back. So it's not going to be that noticeable as a duplicate. That is, unless we're looking at an angle kind of down the middle of the street, which I don't know if I'll do many shots like that. What I intend to do is kind of an orthographic or isometric kind of angle, something like this, focusing on that center corner. And in that way, these aren't really going to be noticeable as duplicates, I don't think. But now that we've got several buildings in here, let's think about some render settings that we used in the other scene but did not make it into the new scene. Let's switch over to our render settings. We are using Eevee. Let's enable ambient occlusion. Let's enable bloom and enable screen space reflections. We also can use a sun. So let's create a new collection, call it lights. Shift A, add a sunlight. All right, let's drag that icon up. Remember, it doesn't matter where we position a sun lamp specifically. It's kind of an infinite light source. All that matters is the rotation. And we're in preview mode, so let's enable scene lights for preview. And now you can start to see some shadows, right? But perhaps the environment that we're using is too strong, because I want the shadows to be a little more noticeable. I like this one at the end. That's a good one. Also, the shadows, I want them to be a little more blue, and then the light source itself to be slightly yellow. And maybe crank up the power to like 10. That's starting to feel like daytime. If we turn off our overlays, yeah, the shadows are looking good. I think that's going to work out well. You know, it's not a super rapid process, but building by building, it does start to complete the city, and that is very exciting. I have a lot of fun doing this. I hope you do too. And at this point, I think you get the idea for what I'm doing, how to populate these city corners. So I think it's appropriate to time-lapse the rest. You can watch it or skip to the next video where we will begin adding our standalone assets. check it out. First stage of assembly is complete. We have streets, we have buildings, and I'm feeling pretty good about the project right about now. However, I should say that originally I planned to kind of encapsulate the city in a row of skyscrapers. And so here I've also reorganized things so that our buildings are organized into blocks. We have the northeast block, northeast because if we look from the top, that is up and right. So northeast, northwest, southwest, southeast, and then the border. Okay, so I started to populate with skyscrapers. The idea behind this was simply to like fence off our city, because whenever I render, let's turn our blocks back on, you know, I didn't want angles that would be open where the street just sort of ends and there's nothing there. But I don't really have the street segment necessary to like put a building right there, because it would need essentially a T intersection, which I just don't want to go back to asset building right now. And besides, ultimately, I want this first version of the city to be inviting to your contributions. And I think leaving the streets open and no border of skyscrapers is more open for contributions to be added to this. And besides, I think I can get my camera angles fine, because ultimately I'm going to be rendering angles like this from an orthographic perspective, which I'm enabling, by the way, with the 5 number pad key. And so as long as I make sure not to get any street borders in the camera frame, we should be fine. Yeah, so camera angles like this, just slightly orbiting. Yeah, so we should be fine without that border of skyscrapers. And so now it's time for phase 2, which is populating our standalone assets. And you know, we have a lot of buildings, so I'm not going to populate each one on camera. I'm just going to focus on one block, the northwestern block. We'll switch over to our standalone ground assets first. And let's throw in a lamppost first. Remember that the linking function does not place our asset on the ground. So if I drag it in the 3D view and then G and hold Control, I need to switch to face snapping. Let's try that again. G, hold Control, and it'll snap to the surface. And I don't want to put it on the corner because we need room for the traffic light. So let's put that in there next. Also note that I have overlays turned off. It's just a cleaner experience, but it is a little confusing to watch. So we can turn that back on so you can see our user interface information. And then Shift D to duplicate that, right click, cancel transformation RZ 180. And then we can move that to the other street corner. All right, now we've got traffic being controlled properly. They're not exactly over the lanes though, are they? I guess it should be more like this. There we go, it's a little more lined up. And then back to the lamppost, Shift D and X. I'm just gonna move it, you know, a decent increment, and then Shift R as many times as I want to populate the rest of the sidewalk. To keep that similar spacing, let's just grab this row, Shift D, right click, RZ90, G, Shift Z, and we'll move that to the other side like this, just keeping them, you know, in the center of this block. We can delete the last one. And how about some foliage? Let's bring some life into this concrete jungle. Let's grab this bush, snap it in front of this storefront. And there's not a lot of room left to walk. We can scale it down a little bit. We can also move our street lamps closer to the street. And then duplicate this bush, move it to the other side. That's a bit more of an inviting storefront. Oh wait, we don't have any, look at that, we don't have any stairs on this side. Also, what is this gap we have? That's on everything. Oh, I know what happened. So I think for our street origins, it uses the top of the curb as the ground when it should be using the sidewalk panel. So I can go into the source file and update everything, or I could just move them all up in here. The problem with moving them all up, select one street segment, Shift G, select the whole collection. I could just move them all up in here, but there's a problem with that. For anyone who uses this asset library, they might not know that it should be moved up. So I think it will make more sense to change the source file. Let's see how far we need to move those up. GZ, how far is that? 0.012. Let's say 0.012. Let's save the file. And then we can, let's see, right click on a street segment and open the blend file. And we need to take all of our ground assets, except maybe our backlot. I think that one is correct. And that could be where some of the intersection issues are coming from. So where did I say 0.013, I think? So we take all of these segments and let's see, tab into edit mode, turn on our overlays, and GZ 0.013. All right, Control S. That's a silly error because I'm saving to a Dropbox location. File save with the @ symbol. Okay, sometimes saving it again fixes that. Sometimes it doesn't, in which case I have to pause syncing and save that way, turn syncing back on when I'm done working. But this is not a Dropbox course. So while I'm here, let's add those steps to the building that we forgot. It's a corner building. I can't remember which. Oh, it's D. All right, so we can tab into edit mode, select the island with L, Shift D, and we'll just move it manually. Let's go back to medium point, RZ90, and just put that in place right there. Okay, Control S, Dropbox error. In fact, I'm going to pause syncing so we don't get that anymore. Control S, there we go. And I'll leave this blend file open in case I have to make any other edits. But now, if we jump over to the Blender file mode of our outliner and right click on the source.blend and reload. Wait a minute. I don't think the street moved. All right, what if we revert? Maybe that wasn't enough? I'm confused because I just moved it 0.013 up again, but that should be built into the asset library. Are these, okay, so this asset is at 0. This asset is at 0. I guess I just need to move it up a little bit more. Okay. Oh. Did only one asset get moved up? Did I think I had them all selected, but only one was selected? That's the issue. You see that? I only moved it up 0.13 on the corner. Got to be careful with those selection tools. Okay. I thought I was going crazy there for a second. All right, so it's just these two. I can tab into edit mode, select everything. Yes, and then GZ 0.013. Save the file, not re-upload. Go back to the Blender file and reload the source. Beautiful. Okay. Where were we? Speaking of contact shadows, check it out. When it comes to Eevee, our lights have a separate contact shadow checkbox, and with that turned off by default, we get these weird shadows where there's gaps between the object and the ground before the shadow starts. So we simply need to go back to our view layer outliner and choose our sun object, go to the object data, under shadow, enable contact shadows. And now we will get a more authentic type of shadow where we feel like the object is definitely touching the ground. Let's turn that on and off again. So yeah, big help. And while I was in the outliner, I noticed we aren't organizing this well at all. So let's find our standalone assets. They were in the buildings collection. So add a new collection, call it standalone. And we'll put all those assets in there. Okay, so Back to population, we added some bushes for some life, and I really like that. Let's add an L bush right around that corner. Maybe switch back to face snapping. That looks good. How about some trees? All right, we'll throw in a small one. And how is the scale feeling? Maybe right here. The scale feels, I don't know, maybe a little bit too big. Maybe the base is too big. Yeah, I think that's what it is. I don't want it touching the building. RZ90. Okay, so it doesn't touch the building. But I think I need to adjust the size of the base. I don't know, maybe not. Let's duplicate a couple more. And each time I duplicate these, I want to remember to rotate them 90 degrees so they don't look identical. And we can also adjust scale slightly. RZ90 again. See, all these look a little bit different. And, you know, maybe I'll move this one down and add a big boy. Or I call it tree medium, but it's much bigger than the others. Let's see, maybe I do need to shrink the scale of the trees. The base, I mean. So let's jump back over to the blend file. In standalone, tree small. Okay, let's select this. S, Shift Z, 0.75. Then switch to our other tree base and do the same thing there. S, Shift Z, 0.75. Control S. Let's reload our blend file. Isn't that fun how they all shrink up? Now, if you ask me, that's the power of the linking function. If we were to append these instead of link, especially if we use just the append, we would have to modify that per tree. And then if we use the append reuse data, we would have to change the tree in here, and all of them would update in this scene, but it would not be updated in the source file. So if someone takes the library and builds their own city, they will be larger. So I like the consistency of linking because it's just very trustworthy. So that's my recommendation. Let's duplicate some trees to the other side. I really like how these trees look. It's a city I want to be in now. Whoops, I didn't need to rotate that because they were already rotated. Now let's take a couple big trees. You know, as we duplicate, I'm trying to be mindful of not repeating in an obvious way. So I'm rotating the trees. I'll slightly scale them up or down. I'll also change the gap between them. And in the end, that just lends itself to a more appealing result. Too much repetition is always a bad thing. I don't want it to cover the lamp. Ah, that's cool. Speaking of being a city I want to be in, let's add a bench because I can imagine sitting here and it's a lovely experience. Let's add another one down the street in between the tree and the lamp. Ooh, I like that. Yeah, that's beautiful. A little closer to the tree. Let's add one to the other side as well. Excellent. And then all we have left are the cars. So let's drag a bus in here. You know, it's pulled up to this bench, picking up new passengers. Well, it's too close to the curb. Let's drag in a car, maybe a couple cars. Updating their color automagically. Gotta love it. And didn't we have a pickup truck? I must not have thrown it in the catalog properly. Yeah, something to note is we cannot drag this to the proper catalog. It has to be done in the source file. So we'll just drag it from the all category or lack of category, I guess. All right, so we've got a few cars. Let's duplicate these to the other side. We've got a couple stopped. Oh, wait a minute. Is this why I needed... Okay, the traffic stuff is coming back to me. So what I actually need for it to make sense, this is a red light, and that single light is controlling both lanes. We're on a one-way, but I don't need two lights controlling the one-way. So this should be this. RZ90. Okay. And I need to update the color of those lights. So let's do that real quick. It's funny, part of me thinks, who cares? No one's going to be paying that close attention. But when you record a tutorial, you really need to have your T's crossed and I's dotted. So where are we at? Traffic light. Yeah, okay, so this is the single by itself. So I just need to make these share object data with this. Now they're green lights. Control S to save. Reload our file. Ta-da! Now the traffic makes sense. But I'm pretty sure if this was a project I wasn't recording, I would have just said whatever. Who cares what the light colors are? But now it makes sense. And we are done with the street level. I mean, well, not done. I could definitely polish this. Like maybe this car is just parked close to the curb. I definitely need more cars because, you know, we only have two and that's pretty obvious in a duplication. But parallel parking, you get the idea. Let's see what this looks like without overlays. Let's turn it on and off. And I think the standalone layer does so much. It feels like a living city. You can imagine these cars puttering down the street. Only thing it's really missing is like people walking, but I don't think that's within scope, at least not yet. How about the roofs? The roofs? The rooftops? Let's jump over to standalone roof. And pretty much every building will need a roof access. Let's drag that there. G and hold control to snap it. It also needs air conditioning. How big is the building? It's fairly big. We could either do one industrial, which is maybe too big. I think I would put that on a skyscraper instead. Maybe give it 2. Ooh, yeah. And then down here, let's use a medium one. And then maybe a couple little guys. Is that purple? Okay, so the randomization isn't perfectly dialed in, but all you have to do is duplicate it to get another version. And that's good enough. Nice. Also a skylight. Yeah, this seems like the type of building that would have one. Let's see, we'll move this to a different side. All right, how about another skylight on these over here? Whoops, Shift D. Oh, and they're lively people. Keep the lights on. Let's see. Since this is a parametric building, you know, the roof looks especially repetitious. And so I think we can just duplicate these kind of inconsistently. Add some rooftops here, some rooftop accesses, maybe oriented slightly different directions. I think that needs to be the other way. Okay. And then give it an industrial. Maybe that's a little too big. We'll just scale it down. It's our world. We can do what we want. And then a couple small ones. Another purple. Didn't realize the saturation was up so much on that. There we go. And now this doesn't look as repetitious. I do wish this one was maybe turned off. Let's try and get one turned off. There we go. Ooh, or we can rotate them and scale them down. Remember on our reference, a lot of these were different sizes. So maybe that one's on, the other one's off. Yeah. Now, let's move on to other buildings. Again, you know, it makes sense to kind of, ooh, look at that. That's very different. I kind of like it. So each building, you know, makes sense to have a roof access. I do wish I had multiple roof accesses just so they weren't all the exact same shape, but hopefully some of you will add new ones to the collection. And this is a pretty small building, so maybe just one medium size, ooh, hello, medium size AC unit. Let's put it beside it right there. Make sure it fits. Scale it down a touch. Very cool. And, you know, what about this neat little kind of rooftop that's accessible from the side of the building? I feel like this would be a fun place to sit. So maybe it deserves an L-shaped bush. Shift D, hold control. Let's rotate it 180. Push it into that corner. Maybe even room for a couple benches. Ooh, perfect. It was meant to be. Oh, I would definitely be hanging out here. Oh, lovely. And, you know, aside from addressing the rest of the rooftops. Oh, there's a major one that we're missing. The water tower. Let's drag that on. Oops. Okay. Okay, so this is offset in the source file. Let's update that. Yeah, look at that. Way off. So let's see. In our item location, in X and Y, I'm going to turn both of those to 0. So to do that for both objects that selected, Alt, click and drag, and type 0. Control S. Water, let's see. I really wish you could kind of reload from in the view layer, but I don't know, maybe it makes sense to do it from here. There we go. Now our water tower, which is huge here. We can scale that down a bit. That is another very common thing to add. Let's put a normal size one up here on the skyscraper. Alt S. Oh, look how much variety there is now. Let's turn off this whole collection. Ooh, not all of them are in there. You really don't want to do that before you've created an even bigger city, because that would be a bit of a nightmare, but we can select all of these. Thankfully, they've all been assigned, I guess, to the scene collection and put those in standalone. Yeah, look at that. Look at the difference. That is huge, and we're not even done. That is cool. This poor building only has one little AC unit. Not very efficient. But I'll bet plenty of real-world city buildings deal with that. Now, the only place not addressed is the backlot. And granted, we're not focused here. I'm not going to be rendering any dedicated shots of the the backlot. But it will be seen enough from the angles I expect if we turn on our other city blocks. You know, from this, you do see just an empty backlot, nothing in there. So I don't want that. What I want is some trees, and we'll scale those up, you know, significantly larger. And, you know, I do think backlots tend to be concrete jungles for the most part, but in our city, people grow trees and have little gardens back here. So we can take some, we have the big ones. Let's take some small trees now. Also some bushes. Maybe we can put 4 in a row to create a little square. Yeah. Maybe put that in the middle. You'll never see it. So maybe leave it out in the open. Oh well, you know, it's our city. We're doing what we want. Perhaps some cars are parked back here. Probably not a city bus, but just the pickup truck and the car. Again, probably not going to be seen, and people might wonder, how did the cars get back there? Well, let's make a little access for it in between these two skyscrapers. Does a car fit? Barely. Good enough for me. So yeah, now the backlot has something, which is all I really want. I don't know, maybe some street lights too. So it's not, you know, Crime Town back here. Crime Town at night. Anyway, that's enough effort for the backlot. Whenever we see it from our hero angles, it's at least going to look touched and not empty. And I imagine by now you kind of get the idea for what it looks like to populate this city. There's a lot left to do. We're not even quite done with this single city block. There's a lot of streets left, other blocks left, but it's fun. I'll be honest. I feel like a kid again, kind of constructing my own imaginary city. And I hope you have a blast doing this as well. And so I'm going to stop this video, finish populating it, and come back when it's done. Behold, our city assembly is complete. Let's just take a moment to enjoy the fruit of our labor. Wow, I love the way this turned out. this is it. This is what the project dreamed of from the very beginning. It was a fair amount of work to get to this point, but the payoff is nice. And wow, those standalone assets do a lot. Let's see a before and after. So this is without that standalone pass, and I didn't think it looked that bad in the last video, but now it just feels super bare and dead. Then we add the standalone layer and it's alive, it's got character, so much to digest visually. And the only asset I forgot about was the signs, because they don't belong in the standalone roof or ground catalog. And hopefully, as you guys contribute, we'll have a bunch of signs, and so it deserves its own catalog. But for now, we just have to find it through the all category. So let's scroll down and let's add these signs. Let's see, what's a good place? How about this is the theater? Why not? So it's set to link. Let's click and drag this into the viewport. As a reminder, we are using links, of course. And remember, the object origin is in the center of this like mounting bracket. And so if I hit G, hold Control and snap, let's rotate in Z 180 degrees. And sure, why couldn't this be a theater? I think that makes sense. What if we made this pink building a hotel? G and hold Control. Let's see, it probably needs to be on the front, most visible from the street, right? Hotel. Yeah, I wish I had a lot more signs. That is just the cherry on top. I can't wait to see the nighttime version. Oh. All right, what else do we have? Park. Let's see, anywhere there's a gap like this one, sure, that's close enough. Let's throw a parking sign in there. I don't know if I like the pink. Let's Shift D to duplicate that a few times until we get a more interesting color. How about this blue? Delete the others. RZ -90, there we go. And that doesn't appear to be snapping. Let's see, where is the object origin? Oh, okay, so it's snapping in the middle. I need to snap above and then move it down manually. Nice. So yeah, there's the signs. You know, I only have 3, but especially the parking and the hotel could be duplicated several places, but I think you get the idea. There's one other thing I wanted to show you, because the population of all these assets took quite a while. It took me, I don't know, maybe 2 or more hours, and I did it in separate sessions because it's fairly monotonous. However, it's pretty enjoyable. And I like the artistic merits of approaching every city block uniquely. However, I totally understand if there's no patience for that. So I wanted to show you that if we open our source file, we can add these assets to the roof of our building asset, right? Since we're assetizing the collection, we can just hop over to that collection, make sure it's selected, and we can click and drag from our standalone roof catalog. Now, you might be wondering, how is this affected whether we use append, reuse data, or link? Now, link, I don't think makes much sense at all because we're just linking into the file from which we're linking from. So I think linking is a bizarre choice in this scenario. But if we use append and reuse data, let's click and drag this roof access. And we don't get the interface because we're not appending an object, we're appending a collection. So this is a collection instance, I believe is the term. And so as long as that's in the collection, we can, just like we did in the assembly, we can place it. Let's see, how am I snapping? Okay, it's on the face, that's good. Let's add an AC unit. And let's say that's good enough. We can Control S to save. And if we hop back over to our assembly, I want you to keep an eye on this building, which I left blank, because whenever we switch to the Blender file version of the outliner and right click on our source file and hit reload, ta-da, we have those assets on every instance of this collection. Over here, you can see it as well. However, on some of those buildings, I already placed standalone assets like this one. So, you know, in theory, what you could do to save a little bit of time is maybe add 1 or 2 assets to every building collection, link those in, and then you would have only a fraction of the empty space left over to add, 1 or 2 more assets to the roof. So I just wanted to show you that that's possible, kind of nesting assets. But for me, I was more than happy to take the time and really enjoy approaching each city block uniquely. And so I am going to undo what I did here and just simply delete them from that collection. Control S, and we'll go back to our assembly. And even though as a whole it looks pretty good right now, I think we can make this look just a little bit prettier with a proper render and some minor tweaks with the compositor. If you've watched any of my courses before, you can probably guess what I'm going to do here, but let's add a camera. First, let's make sure we're putting it in an intentional collection. Oh, the signs are not in an intentional collection. Let's throw those into standalone. And also, while I'm thinking about it, the jury is out on how I should organize the outliner. I'm wondering if I should add a collection for each city block, and then within that block it has all the relevant standalone assets as well, rather than, imagine that this city is 10 times the size after your contributions, and we just have massive numbers of assets in a few number of collections. So anyway, this will probably update over time, but for now, that's what I'm going with. And what was I talking about? Oh, that's right. I need to add a camera. So let's create a new collection. We'll call it render. And inside that, Shift A, camera, and 0 on the number pad to look through the camera. Now, in the in panel, in the view tab, let's enable camera to view. And this way, when we navigate like usual in the viewport, our camera will follow it. Let's, in our camera data parameters, let's enable the Passepartout. Well, it's actually already enabled inside the viewport display, Passepartout all the way up. I just don't like seeing what's outside the camera view. And so I moved this away from the world origin just so we could see, kind of a general angle of the city that we're going for. But I'm actually going to switch the type of camera from perspective to orthographic. This will give us that isometric aesthetic, which disallows us to zoom in and out using Control middle mouse drag. Instead, we just have to change the orthographic scale if we want to quote unquote zoom out, but we can still orbit. And so I'm going to look for a decent angle. I've got several that I like. I think this one's pretty cool, looking down kind of Main Street. But another element we can add to make this look a little bit prettier is depth of field. So let's enable depth of field, and immediately you'll see a really intense level of depth of field. So we need a focus object. Now, I think if we choose one of our first car assets, so if we type CAR, vehicle car CG cookie, should be the first one we added, which if I remember correctly was towards the middle of that main intersection. And yes, it is. We can either do that, or we can add a dedicated object, which I often do. Let's add an empty plain axis and call it cam_focus. And then that's very obvious. Wherever we move that empty is where the camera will be focused. So let's grab that instead. And that should be at the center of the world. And with a depth of field, we're going to start to get this kind of tilt shift lens effect. And so with the f-stop, let's go way up to like 15. What about 10? We just don't want the blur to be ridiculous. So if we go up to 20, I think in between 20 and 10 is what's going to look the best. So I really like this angle. I also remember, I love this angle here, because these tall skyscrapers on the right are really blurred out. And it just, I don't know, feels like a dense populated city. But the main focus of the image is on our main intersection, which is nicely populated with all our goodies. So let's stick with this one for now. When I like a camera angle, I'll simply disable camera to view and make sure my render settings should be default, so 1080p, and let's do a render. Since it's Eevee, it should be almost instantaneous. And our shadows are super dark because we are not using a world, we're just using the viewport world. So let's escape that, and we're using material preview in the viewport. And so if we want to use that at render time, we need to load that HDRI from the Blender app into our scene. And that's fine, but I think I'll just create a simple gradient for our world instead, because the shadows from this HDRI are a little bit more blue. That's the reason I chose this particular one, but it's not as blue as I would like them to be. So this is a good opportunity to just create a new world. We'll change our asset browser at the bottom to our shader editor, switch to the world. And this is going to be very simple. Shift A, texture gradient, and then Control T to give us our texture coordinate and mapping node. I feel like I'm talking to you like you've never seen these nodes before, but in this course, we just got pretty deep into this stuff. So I shouldn't have to explain so much. We need a gradient texture, and let's rotate around our viewport so we can see this in rendered mode. Shift Control click, and then we're going to rotate in the Y-axis 90 degrees. I think, yes. This puts the black at the bottom, white at the top. I'm going to add a converter color ramp and then drag the white flag pretty far down. Switch the interpolation to ease. And the black will become like a brownish ground color. Not too saturated, but pretty dark, because we don't want any additional light coming from the ground, or at least very little. And then control click in the white section and change this to like a cyanish blue, kind of mid saturation. And then add another flag up top, and this will be very blue. And then we'll need to drag them down. And let's see, what is our color space? Our render settings, color management, we're in Filmic, which is fine. What does it look like standard? Let's switch between those. Standard and Filmic. Standard, Filmic. I'm trying to get used to Filmic because I'm slowly getting on board that this is a better option. However, what threw me off ever since Filmic was introduced is that the exposure and gamma default settings are pretty bad. And so it looks bad right away, but if we adjust this stuff, we can get a much better result. Okay, I think that looks good. Our shadows are very blue now. If we mute this color ramp, you can see they're just, darkened shadows, and then now they're quite blue. Hopefully not too blue. Maybe we need to change the sun color to be a little more saturated in the orange direction. All right, now we're getting that kind of golden hour coloration, which I think complements the type of style we're going for. Okay, now we should be able to render this. Control space to maximize it. Ooh, yeah, doesn't that look yummy? I don't like that this little sliver of the building is showing through. So let's adjust our camera ever so slightly. I know that might be kind of nitpicky. Select our camera, G, hold shift, and just move it to the right a little bit. All right. Render again. Very nice. Okay. Let's jump to the compositing workspace. Use nodes. Make a little bit of room here. Shift right click and drag to create a reroute node. Shift control click on that reroute node to bring in a viewer node so we can see it in the backdrop of our compositor node canvas. The V key will shrink that. Hit the N key to get a little more real estate. And let's see. I'm not going to do too much. I'm going to play around with color balance node. All right, if I hold Alt and move with middle mouse, we can kind of push that up a little bit. And let's just play around with the lift. We want to be fairly subtle. Let's go towards the blue in the lift, and then maybe kind of reddish. Maybe green. I'm really just kind of playing with it. Yeah, I think reddish. Let's turn that on and off. Let's bring up the gain a little bit. Maybe that's too much. Turn it on and off. I don't know. I might like it raw without the color balance. That's typical workflow for me. Throw a color balance in there, play with it, turn it on and off, see if it's an improvement or not. But in this case, I'm thinking it's maybe not. Okay, so let's leave that muted for now. And then I want to add a vignette. So in our matte category, let's go with ellipse mask. And we get a little white, boundary for that ellipse. So let's drag out the width, then the height. Shift Control click on that. So we can see that it needs a filter blur, not bokeh blur. And the type, we'll switch to fast Gaussian. I'm going to enable relative, and then let's say 30% blurred. Okay, a very broad fall off, light in the center, dark around the edges, specifically the corners. And then we can color mix that as an overlay. And let's go to 0 to start off with. Shift Control click on that. So we see no difference. And then as we drag it up, everything around the borders gets a little darker and a little more saturated. Everything in the middle gets a little brighter. So we'll turn that on and off. I think it's too strong at 0.8. Let's go to 0.5, turn that on and off. Yeah, I think that's it. Okay, now render, view render, and look at our viewer node. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Now, I just noticed that I left our lights emitting, or I should say the material emitting, even though it's a daytime scene. And I don't think it looks terrible, but I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense, especially when we want to explore a nighttime version and that material emitting is one of the main characteristics. So I will turn that off. Let's go back to previous and back over to our source file. Let's select an object that has that glass emit material. And we need to see the material or the shader editor. And remember that multiply node determines how bright. Let's go down to 0, Control S, jump back over to the assembly, Blender file, right click on the source file and reload it. And then let's render again. This time it will have the compositing on top of it. There we go. No lights being emitted. And that looks like a proper daytime scene. Pretty cool. Now that the compositing nodes are set up, let's explore the nighttime scene. When I started to daydream about a nighttime version to this scene, I really wanted it to be pretty easy to switch. I didn't want it to be a major effort in setting up new lights or setting up emissions for relevant materials. In order to be worth doing, it needed to be a simple shift. And I think we've got a pretty simple setup right now. So if we go back to the layout workspace, actually, let's go back to view the render and switch to slot 2 so we can go to the before and after. Escape out of that. And this is the 3D view, and we need to change our world. So I'm going to name this to Cubicity Daytime, or let's say Golden Hour. And we'll make that a fake user, and then we will duplicate this and call it Cubicity Night. And all we're really doing here is changing the gradient, or these 3 color flags. And let's change this white one. It's going to be the same lightest on the bottom of the horizon, darkest, more saturated towards the top of the sky. But we don't want to go to white. We want it to be kind of a darker cyan, not quite as saturated, but definitely much darker. And then we'll step up to a deeper blue, also darker. And maybe I only need the 2 flags. Let me just adjust these until we get something that looks nice. We don't want to go all the way to black. What if we did add a 3rd and made it like a purple, like a real deep, dark purple? Ooh, yeah, that looks pretty good. Now, I don't need to obsess over this too much because we're not going to be seeing the gradient. It's just all about the color that it contributes. And when it comes to night, that means pretty much 0 contribution. Not actually 0, though. Again, you never want it to be black, but obviously a lot less than daytime. Okay, so let's say we have the world dialed in pretty well. Obviously, those shadows are very dark. How about we turn off the sun? So yeah, this is a pretty dark city. Maybe even the ground should be black, actually. Very, very dark city. Yeah, I think it looks like a blackout type thing. So how about we duplicate the sun? Shift D. Well, I guess it needs to be visible to be selected. Shift D. Can you not Shift D in the outliner? I guess not. Shift D. Okay, there we go. Right click so we don't move it. We'll call this moon. Turn off the sun in the viewport and in the render. And then for the moon, let's make it a pale purple. And the strength to like 1. Again, very, very subtle. Maybe even 0.5. Hardly anything. The reason being, the main player in the nighttime scene is that emissive material. So let's switch over to our source. Select an object with that emissive material, which we already have selected, and let's change it to 20 was the value we liked. Control S, and just like that, reload our source reference. Right click, reload, and we've got our lights. And in fact, I do think our world is a little too dark. So let's increase the value of everything. Also the moon. Nah, that's starting to look too much like a sun. That's not too bad. Let's see. Oh, we're not even plugging this into the background where we have control of the strength. Let's see. What if we change the strength to 2? I think it's maybe a little too saturated. Shift A, color, or hue saturation. It's not actually called the HSV node. And let's say take the saturation to 0.9, maybe 0.7. Okay. Now we can see a little bit more of what's going on. There is one crucial problem though. Initially, I thought that's all we would have to do is have an emissive material, a nighttime world environment, and then maybe a moonlight. But the lamps, the street lamps, do not contribute to the lighting of our street. And that's very characteristic of city streets, where at the street level, it's quite bright due to all the street lamps. Also, our cars have headlights that are emitting quite bright, but nothing actually contributing to the ground. So we need to add some lamps in our source file. All right, so let's go to, first we'll do our standalone street lamp. Where is that lamppost? Here it is. Now I might need a temporary object in here to gauge the strength of the light we're about to add. So in the scene collection, or in the utility collection rather, let's turn that on and Shift A. Let's add a mesh plane. Alt G to move it to the ground, scale it up. And let's throw on that Cubicity backlot material. Okay, so what I want to do is add a lamp to the top of this object. All right, so let's just select these faces. Shift S, cursor to selected. Back to object mode, Shift A, and let's add a light spotlight. Okay, let's also change the world environment to be something more conducive to a nighttime scene. Okay, so now we've got our spot lamp. It's very low strength, so let's change that to like 100. Is that going to be bright enough? Maybe 250. Let's change the color. Typically, it's like a deeper orange for these street lamps, orangish yellow. It's also matching the emissive color that we added. And then I just need to expand the size. Under spot shape, let's make it much bigger. Okay, not that big. Let's say 125 degrees. I think that looks good. And then the blend, we want to take that up so that it's a very smooth fall off. And even maybe we can go up a little higher, like 150. And then in the shadow, let's enable contact shadows. We just know now that that's a big boost in the quality of shadows, specifically where objects touch one another. And you might be wondering, we put that lamp inside of the mesh. So how is the light getting out? I don't exactly know why. I thought it was the clip start, meaning that shadows would only start a certain distance from the object. And so that's why light was able to escape that. But changing this doesn't seem to have much effect. So I don't know exactly, but I do know that it's working. So let's make sure that this object, which I think I added to the utility collection, which is not what I want. Let's hit M in the viewport and throw it into standalone lamppost. And I will rename this to lamppost light in all caps. All right, now when we Control S to save it, jump back over to our assembly and reload. Our streets are illuminated by the lampposts. think it's probably a little too bright at 250 or whatever I added. So let's change that to like 100. Control S, and let's reload one more time. Very nice. How about the power of linked collections, right? It makes this kind of change extremely easy. If we appended all these, that would definitely not be easy. And now all that's left is to do the same thing to our vehicles. All right, so we can turn off the lamppost collection. Let's find the vehicle car. And let's just duplicate it from the lamppost. Shift D to duplicate, M, move to the car collection. And that was a Shift D, okay? It's not a linked duplicate, that's important. Let's turn off the lamppost and we'll rename this let's see, just car headlamp underscore light. Okay, so this needs a much smaller size. Let's go with 60 for now. Rotate it in Y 90 degrees and just position that in front of our headlight. Let's maybe take down the saturation to like 0.6 or maybe even towards yellow, just so it's not exactly the same as the street lamps. All right, now here I'm going to Alt D so it maintains that linked connection. And so if I ever want to change the color, it'll happen on both of them, or change the strength, it'll happen on both of them. Let's see what 100 looks like. Control S to save. Jump back over to the assembly, reload, and all our cars should have headlights. Well, our cars, not the pickup trucks or buses. That will be next. Okay, the contact shadows that we enable do require more processing power. So since we're going to have a lot of these lights on the vehicles, I don't think they really need the extra processing power. So let's disable contact shadows for these. We'll leave them on the street lamps because I think those are a little more important. Control S, and let's see if anything noticeable shifts in our assembly. You can see our scene is still pretty responsive, but the more lights we add, the less responsive it will be. So it's good to be mindful of that. And let me quickly add our lights to our other vehicles. Shift D, right click, M in the viewport, move them to the pickup truck collection. We can hide the car. And I will just speed this process up because it's nothing new. I did copy the name to both of them, which automatically iterates one of them, and then I just need to Control L link object data. I think it will make sense to add a slightly different color. Maybe take this closer to white. You know, no one's headlights are exactly the same. How about 150, a little bit brighter? And then let's just duplicate one of them this time. Shift D, we will move it to the proper collection, the bus collection. We can hide the pickup truck and position this properly. Alt D, duplicate, and let's make this, you know, one of those newer age, almost white lights. I personally hate those, so I don't know why I even attempted it. Not completely white, bluish, but just the tiniest bit of yellow. And rename those. Make sure that they're still linked. Yeah, okay. Now we can Control S to save and reload our assembly. There we go. Let's go back to our camera now. Make sure, I think I know for sure that it is slot 2. Let's render for comparison. Ooh. Ooh. I love that. And yes, I know that our parked cars all have their lights on, but let's just keep that a secret between us and tell ourselves that no one else will know. Alt J to see the daytime to nighttime. Yes, I love that. I've been looking forward to this moment the entire course, honestly, and I am not disappointed. One very important caveat about using lamps with Eevee is that there is a limit to how many there are in the scene. So I noticed this whenever I created this animation of the cars kind of looping around the blocks, because some of the cars did not have lamps anymore. Some do and some don't. And I didn't realize why until Martin informed me that Eevee has that limit. So if we read in the documentation, only 128 active lights can be supported by Eevee in a scene. And it doesn't matter the fact that we're using instances, it's still having to calculate shadows and emission for those objects. And so this is a pretty big deal if we wanted to do a larger city with even more lights. That's simply not going to be possible with Eevee at this point. And so unfortunately, this reduces the nighttime scene to just a fun exercise for you and your small city block assembly, because I think the nighttime version really struggles if we turn off our lights. It's just a much more underwhelming result. So yeah, that's one very important caveat to be aware of. So that is how we can switch from daytime to night. Now, what about going back to daytime? Well, all we have to do is in our source file, if we filter the outliner, turning off all object types except for lights and collections, I need to turn those off as well, then we can simply turn off the monitor icon and the render icon if you plan on rendering. And when we Control S to save, all these lights will be turned off in the assembly. We also need to change the emission to 0. And that should be it for the source file. Now when we go back to the assembly and reload, all our lights are turned off. So we need to change back to the proper world, enable our sun, disable our moon, and that's how we switch back and forth. Yes, that was several steps, but all things considered, not a big effort for such a transition. Let's look at that one more time. Daytime, nighttime. I'm happy with that. One last thing to go over, I almost missed the fact that we have 2 new assets that we can add to our asset library, and that is our 2 world environments, Cubicity Golden Hour and Cubicity Night, because the asset browser accepts worlds, so we might as well do that. However, we have a little bit of a weird starting point because these worlds exist in the assembly file. But if I want to assetize them, I want to move them to the asset.blend file. And so I need to append the worlds from the assembly into our asset file, assetize them here, then go back to the assembly, delete that data, and then link it from the asset browser. It's going to be a bit of a weird exchange of data, but it's going to be the cleanest way to assetize and assemble everything. And it's probably going to be useful information for kind of troubleshooting and working with asset library data. So I'm going to jump over to our assets.blend file, and I'm going to go to File, Append, and then let's navigate up till we find the assembly version 01, and I'm looking for World, and let's grab both of these. Shift-Control clicking on them, and Append. Now if we switch our shader editor to be the world, we have Cubicity Golden Hour and Cubicity Night. Now we can add this as an asset by right-clicking here where we select a world environment and choose Mark as Asset. You can also go to our Blender file under Worlds, and I can select both from here by shift-clicking, right-click, and Mark as Asset. All right, we see those have been added. Cubicity Golden Hour. There's the other one right there. Now, what about the preview? This doesn't tell me a whole lot, but if I look in the viewport, going back to the view layer outliner, let's turn off our assets. And then in our viewport shading options, let's change world opacity to 1, and let's use the scene world. There we go. Trying to just find a decent representation. I think this will be fine. How about, since I'm on Windows, Shift, Windows key S, and I'll take a square screenshot. I will save this in my thumbnails folder. Cubicity World Night. And then I'll take a similar one for the daytime. or golden hour. And now I can set that up. Make sure we do the right one. There we go. Okay, so I actually don't want the worlds necessarily visible. I guess that's fine. All right, Control S to save our assets. And now jump back over to our assembly. And here's where I want to delete this leftover data. So I'm going to uncheck fake user for both of them. And then I'm going to hold Shift and click the X. So by holding the Shift, it removes either a world or a material slot for everything. So it should be left with 0 users. And once you have 0 users, you can go to File, Clean Up, Unused Data Blocks. And this will purge 2 unused data blocks, 2 worlds. And now those are completely gone. I'm going to Control S to save, and then we can split our window here, open the asset browser, and I need to put them into a category. So how about we add a new catalog, worlds. Let's throw them in there. Control S to save. And if we reload the library, we have worlds, and we were using the daytime one since the sun is visible. So we can throw, let's see. Actually, how do we do this? Do we, let's see, just drop it in the viewport? Oh, that's how we do it. Okay. There we go. So now they are linked in instead of being sourced in this file. So the assembly remains almost entirely linked, except for like the sun and moon assets and a couple render objects. Okay, so that's how we can assetize worlds, and we can be done with this lesson.